I think there will be a nuclear war toward the latter part of this decade. And your listeners, if you're interested in liberty and finance, need to really understand that. Because even though the media is not going to warn about you, our government is building deep underground bunkers. They know it's coming, and they're preparing their retreats, etc.
Here at Liberty and Finance, we're licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. We are standing by the inventory, ready to make sure you get what you need, even into the wee hours of night and on weekends, because preparedness doesn't stop. Call us 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. It's not often we've had this distinguished returning guest on. Joel Skousen, a former military pilot, the editor of the World Affairs Brief, and author of two seminal books that are widely used by those who seek preparedness. But one is called Strategic Relocation. The fourth edition just came out in 2021. And The Secure Home, talking about defensive architecture. Joel Skousen, thanks for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
Well, it's good to be with you again in these very troubled times.
It has been an intense couple of years. We've been talking for a decade or so about this on our channel, previously known as Reluctant Preppers, now Liberty and Finance. And for most of that period of time, we were considered out of step with the mainstream reality, whatever. And maybe that's still true, but it's interesting to see how many people in the communities around us and across the country and across the world are waking up because of basically the hand being exposed of those who would like to dictate our futures, control our ability to move, control our freedoms, our ability to grow food, et cetera, to protect ourselves. You have been professionally assisting people for decades with strategic relocation planning, as well as defensive architecture and building secure homes. You do it for very elite clients. You do it on an informational basis for all those who read your books and your works and your writings. We have a lot of questions that have been submitted ahead of your arrival. Not a big surprise, given how eventful these last 2 years have been. And you and I were just talking about how busy this has been a time for you, with so many people trying to make their move now, trying to get their preparedness finally taken care of. Let's start there with, you were mentioning some mega trends of people, this mass exodus from some of these states such as California, New York, and others, where there have been real concerns about lockdowns and that kind of thing. People have been living through, seeking freedom, and what that's doing to the remaining opportunities for people to find those properties where they can live free lives. What are you seeing? What are the big trends that people need to be aware of?
Well, the big trend, of course, has to do with a dual threat, and that is the exodus from people with a large amount of money and cash from California, New York, and other blue states that were heavy into the lockdowns and exercising these unconstitutional emergency orders, taking away essential liberties. And I've never seen in the real estate market, for example, such a high percentage of people buying houses with cash and overbidding the asking price by tens of thousands of dollars and then throwing cash on the table. It's really hard to beat that. What it's done is, in the best states for relocation, in the West, for example, Utah and Idaho, and in the Midwest in Texas, it's driven up prices tremendously and made it very difficult. And in the top-rated states in strategic relocation, Idaho and Utah, there's hardly anything available now. I mean, it's not a matter of money anymore. It's a matter of what do you get. There's a lot of land that is how should I say, dry, high desert or desert land without water, and that's useless to buy. And even that's high price, but you don't dare buy land in these areas without water rights, and it's very difficult. So the inflation has been not only being pushed up in land prices, but also in inflation and shortages, because first of all, it started with the bailouts of the COVID, where you injected, some Well, it turned out to be almost $13 trillion into the economy. And a lot of that, unlike the normal procedure where you give it to the Wall Street banks and it boosts the stock market, they did that too. But when you put it in the hands and pockets of people, you really increase inflation dramatically. And unfortunately, Breitbart just came out with an article trying to debunk the attitude that this is only greedy corporations because they've shown the highest profits in many, many years last year during high inflation. And I don't debunk that. I think the corporations, the builders, the contractors have taken advantage of years of flat growth to just jump on this bang and boost prices because people have no choice. So there is a lot of greed involved in that. And unfortunately, I don't see an end to it. At best it might level up, but inflationary prices never really go down.
Now, you talked about the scarcity of available land for people who are doing strategic relocations or trying to. A lot of the places are being bought up by people with deep pockets from some of these states where they're fleeing. Does it shift your pattern of recommended areas that people should be considering into any secondary tiers that you may have looked for in the past? There are several questions around this, and I apologize in advance to people who submitted these, because if I start reading them all by name, a lot of these are on themes, and this is one of the themes, is do you have new areas that you're looking at now, or perhaps you already had looked at before, but you're saying, well, gosh, if the massive trends are flowing into these initial areas, here are some secondary areas that people should still be considering.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point, and I'm having to reassess in terms of value the Midwest states. In other words, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and other areas where land has not gone up as much because it isn't looked upon as desirable. But and I might say, in reference to your comment, I really don't deal much with the elite. Very little. Most of my work is with common people, middle-class people, a few wealthy people, but I don't like working with the elite. I don't like working with people who have been blind to the threats for so long and then want to throw their money at me just to save themselves. I'm really philosophically more aligned with the common and middle-class person who really wants to serve, to protect himself. And those people need to have property that they can afford. And unfortunately, it's out of the question now, almost in Utah and Idaho, and even in the most desirable areas of Texas. Texas has been a real draw because it's a no-income tax state. It's big. It's got a conservative reputation, but it's actually on the cusp. 50-50 Democrat-Republican, especially as more liberals move into California and more illegals get voting rights. I expect Texas to be a blue state within the next 5 or 6 years. And that will change its dynamics dramatically. But in Texas itself, and I just spoke at the Exit and Build conference near Austin, Texas this past weekend, where there's a tremendous amount of interest in exiting the cities in getting into intentional, self-sufficient, agricultural-based communities. And so in Texas, which I got a chance to analyze as I flew over the state and toured it, forget about Dallas-Fort Worth, forget about Austin, Texas. These cities are corrupt. They're ruled by Democrats. You have to get out into the less desirable areas that are cheaper. And that's the function of land prices now, is you get into the less demand area and the prices go down. But there is still a lot you can do. You have to do remediation. There's caliche, hard pan soil, makes it difficult to do basements, and we can't do high security construction in a place without basement space. So that becomes a major criteria and difficulty in a place like Texas. But as you get further into West Texas, outside of the Dallas-Fort Worth, you get into some nice ranch country, and it is available much more so than in Utah and Idaho. But I am increasing my recommendations in the Midwest, especially in Missouri and Oklahoma, for better retreat sites.
There have been some people that pointed out that areas that they found in even Tennessee, in certain parts there, low population areas, as well as in certain parts of Florida, might also be desirable from a plentiful water availability and, again, low low population density in some of those areas. Are some of those secondary or tertiary areas in your list of priorities?
Tennessee is, and Kentucky, being the closest if someone has to retreat or relocate and still be close to the East Coast, which is the main problem sectors that Northeast sector cleared down almost to and through North Carolina now, or at least northern North Carolina, is such high population density it's not safe. So Tennessee and Kentucky become the safest areas, and eastern Tennessee and Kentucky are better than western. Western Tennessee, for example, you got Memphis dominating that area. It's a very corrupt city, very dangerous. You got to stay at least an hour's drive away from a major city to avoid the refugee flows that will happen during war or an EMP strike that takes down the grid for a long period of time. But yes, Tennessee and Kentucky have always been in my area. The southern states, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, away from the coast, that is the upper half of those away from military targets, are also economically viable now, especially if you're looking for retreating out of Atlanta, which is a no-go place now in terms of population density, getting into Alabama. Away from Huntsville and other nuclear targets, you can find some good rural areas. You do have some minority potential conflicts there in the future that you don't have so much in the Midwest. As you can see, it's a complex process. A lot of people call me up and say, well, just tell me where the safest place is. Well, the safest place technically is in the middle of the Nevada desert, 4 hours away from any facilities or any people. But what kind of life is that? And how do you convince your wife to move out there? So safety is not the only issue. You've still got to deal with family, climate, growability, water supply, and pollution, and military targets, and things like that. So that's why Strategic Relocation, my book, is such a bestseller now, is because it goes through all of the threats. It goes through and rates every single state according to every one of the threats, from homeschooling laws to medical freedom to population density to political leanings, etc. And it's just a gold mine of information for help people make the complex compromises they have to be relatively safe. And that's all I can promise nowadays.
Right. And I think you've just touched on this one from Fontana Ranja, who asks, many people's instinct is to get as far away from civilization as possible, and remoteness can be an asset, but some properties are completely or seasonally inaccessible if automobile travel is not possible or too expensive. How would you weigh a remote property against the option of being out of large cities but near a small town community?
That's a great question. Let's take, Tennessee, for example. My highest rated area in Tennessee is the Cumberland Plateau. There's no major city up there. It's very rural. And for highly remote areas, they are safer, but I kind of recommend a two-step retreating process, meaning you have a city home, or at least near the city, in rural areas around a city. You don't want to really be in the city anymore. And then you have, within an hour's drive or so, a retreat that you can get to, so that you don't have to live so remote that you can't get. I mean, one of the problems I have with people who get 2 hours away from a city is that when you try to build a retreat property or a new home, for example, and you've got to travel 2 hours, that's a total round trip of 4 hours plus the shopping time to go get supplies, or you run out of something or get a part. It's just very, very difficult to operate. You spend a lot of time on the road. And in hard times, you don't want to be so remote that you really will be in danger of running out of your fuel supplies or other things. So I find the optimum distance is about an hour's drive away from a major metro for a full-time, safe living condition in rural areas. And then you can retreat further on if you need to. In fact, I always recommend people have a backup plan. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. And another advantage of the two-step retreat program is that you want to have all your tags from government, the internet, NSA spying and everything going to a residence where they expect you to be. And then if you have a retreat site, don't take your cell phone out to the retreat site, or turn it off so that it can't be tracked up there. So that when they put on geolocation, et cetera, and the apps, by the way, on your phone are some of the worst for geolocation tracking, shut that thing off completely before you go out to a retreat site, so there are no traces that go out there. Put it in the name of an LLC, so that it's very difficult to find you when they come looking.
You've talked about some themes that are probably familiar to most. This question asks us about what we aren't talking about. Lucky Hopkins says, most people seem to be aware of the need for growing food, having gold or silver, and being out of the cities. What is a big concern you see which is being overlooked?
Well, first of all, let me cover the things that he mentioned, which are problems. Those are common solutions. People like gold and silver, for example. Gold in a real crisis is going to be too expensive to use because you can't get change for a $2,000 gold coin, let alone for a $20,000 gold bar. That's why I think in terms of barter that silver dollars are really your best. They're not that expensive. They're big, fat, and heavy, and they're beautiful. And it's pretty easy to convince somebody they're worth $30. And you don't have to get, if you take a loss, to get change for it. But by far and away, although this is counterintuitive to preppers, is that greenbacks, cold cash, is going to be the most useful thing if the grid goes down, for example, and there's no more money printing and there's no electronic. If you got in Bitcoin, you're going to lose everything with the internet or when the grid goes down because the internet's going to go down. You won't be able to access it. And that's why the government will be not going fully to digital currency probably until what they think after the next war. But if it happens before this war, we're going to lose everything, have no access to anything if the grid goes down, because we don't stockpile in the United States any of the long-distance transformers. Maybe 5 or 6 we have, but there are thousands. And if the grid goes down, they're all made in China. They're not going to be giving us, because basically they're going to take the grid down as part of a preemptive nuclear strike on American military, not cities, military forces. So that's the one thing that most people don't have on their radar because it's not in the mainstream media. The future war coming, and it'll be preceded by about 15, 20 minutes with a preemptive EMP strike, which will take down the grid. And the second thing that people are not thinking about is concealed safe room storage space. Financial-wise, your wisest investment prior to the next war will be to eliminate your future need for money, period. You don't have to worry about pensions, savings, which will be gone. You have stockpiled almost everything that you normally buy, and you have to secure that in safe, concealed spaces, and that means basement space. And then you've eliminated your future need money, and you can weather a year's storm without electricity. But people who keep trying to have stock of bitcoins and gold and silver and other things, especially the worst ones, the people who have silver and gold stockpiled in somebody else's vault or across the country or outside the country worse, they're not going to be able to retrieve that. So people are not considering the potential war between Russia and China and the West, which they are preparing for. All of the weapons of mass destruction there are not defensive, they're offensive. And the fact that our own government is going to allow that strike to occur is off people's radar.
We're going to circle back and talk about geopolitics near the end there. We're still on the kind of the individual scale in the local communities. EM asks, are you considering the issue, and it sounds like you have, of personal freedom when analyzing the best areas for strategic relocation? If so, what states are the best for personal freedom?
Well, the personal freedom took a real hit during COVID, because obviously the emergency orders allowed the government to essentially take away all your personal liberty in the name of health. And so it's a game changer. All of the previous statistics by foundations about what are the most privacy-oriented states are out the window, because every state, including Republican states, went along, at least initially, with the lockdowns, which were foolish, which were stupid, which were far more damaging to the economy and people's lives than the healthy people that got COVID. So it's really the only way that you're going to find widespread liberty now, personal liberty, is with states that are overwhelmingly conservative, because of the threat of democratic states, for example, to go along with the COVID false narrative of this exaggerated pandemic. And the resistance is happening now. For example, Texas is a pretty free state, and you get a lot of freedom, by the way, by having raw rural land away from government. That's what we learned in COVID, for example, is that in the rural areas, you hardly saw any masks. They didn't have the masked Gestapo running around trying to, nor the vaccine police. And that's going to be the wave of the future. You've got to be rural. You cannot depend on personal liberty within the cities, especially all the major cities in the United States are run by Democratic mayors or Rhino Republican mayors. So you've got to be rural, and you've got to be in overwhelming conservative states, even though they all have Rhino Republican governors, except for the potential of Florida, which is a temporary anomaly. I think the establishment is going to try to get DeSantis out of Florida, as well as Kristi Noem. The establishment media in both those states hate those governors. So you don't want to base your desire for personal liberty based upon a governor, because that can change. And with today's deep state and the election fraud threats that are there, we just can't depend on political solutions. You've got to be self-sufficient, you've got to be rural, you've got to be secure, and you've got to prepare to hide things, including people someday who might be targeted as dissidents by government.
Your comment about the difference that people experienced in rural areas versus in urban areas during the lockdowns was echoed by our guest, Joel Salatin from Polyface Farms in Virginia. He said they were what he described in a bubble out there in the farm. He said the sun comes up every day, the strawberries need picking, the crops and the livestock need watering, and you go about your business and you go through your day. And then he said then there would be these visitors come in to buy their goods from their farm stand, their large farm store. And he said you'd see the fear in the eyes of the mask-wearing those from the city versus the relaxed, confident nature of those who lived in the country. It was just two different worlds. We're living in the same world, but it was two completely different emotional and psychological and behavioral experiences that those people went through.
Yes, I met Joel. He and I both spoke at the Exit and Build conference near Austin, and I followed his work for many years. It was good to meet him in person.
He's been a frequent guest on our channel, and glad to have you back here as well. There are two more questions about a little bit off the beaten track about relocation before we move on to geopolitics. One is from Eric Everson. Does Joel still recommend Uruguay for overseas relocation?
Well, in terms of Latin America, Uruguay is still probably the best in South America proper, but I am very negative about Latin America. Now, keep in mind, I've lived there myself for several years, and I know and I speak the languages down there, and I can tell you that there has been a strong turn to the left that's happened. Chile elected a communist, for example, far left in Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador. Lula da Silva, the top communist in South America, is threatening to take back over Brazil, so you have Argentina and Brazil surrounding Uruguay. Uruguay's got a very weak army. But if you, and there's two parts of Uruguay. One is on the coast, which is where all your elite from the West in Europe, and it's a dollar economy on the coast. It's very expensive on the coast. It's the resort communities. But the interior of Uruguay, if you know Spanish, and you've got to know Spanish to live on the interior, can be fairly safe. Now, it is run by a leftist government, as all the governments in Latin America are. They're all socialist. My problem is that during the lockdown, they all drunk the Kool-Aid about lockdowns. And in fact, almost 2/3 of the countries wouldn't let you leave, even if you didn't have COVID. They wouldn't let you leave the country. And that doesn't speak well as the fact that they can change their laws so rapidly. So many people looking for foreign retreat things make the major mistake of judging their retreat potential based upon current conditions in the expat community. There's all kinds of expats that have lived all over Latin America and talk about how wonderful it is to live in cheap Latin America. But they're going to be hurting someday, because when war comes and there's no more tourist dollars that keep these countries solvent, they're going to start, I think, to attack foreign interest and foreign bank accounts, et cetera, there. And you might have a resentment factor. And lastly, I can count on less than 100, maybe, the people who understood liberty in the various countries I live in each country. Whereas in the United States, we have millions who understand. Now, they may have acquiesced to the stupidity of the COVID pandemic during that, and many drank the Kool-Aid. But when push comes to shove, we have the background, the potential of resistance in the millions, which you can't say. And it's also easier to blend in and hide in the United States. You can't blend in very well in Latin America. Even if you speak Spanish with the tiniest accent, they can detect you. So I don't recommend any foreign country for Americans, including Canada, especially Canada, as a retreat site anymore, because of the tyranny that came about because of COVID and the increasing leftist move politically that these countries are undergoing. And by the way, I might say that China has a very heavy effect in South America, and they will take Panama, for example, during the next war and occupy it. So you don't want to be near Panama or in Panama, which is a good, quote, expat location right now, but it's not going to be if the Chinese occupy, and you don't want to live under Chinese occupation.
We've certainly heard more and more stories over the past several years of Chinese influence increasing, not only in the South American area and Central America, but also in Africa and in other regions as well. They're building all kinds of inroads, literally, building ports, building roads, building railways, building airports, building all kinds of infrastructure to solidify relationships and influence in those countries. And if people talk about, Putin having his thumb on Western Europe as far as controlling their natural gas supply, for example, that sort of thing. Well, China controls the supplies of a lot of things, not only to the U.S., but a lot of other countries around the world.
No, absolutely. And China is a huge threat. Now, I don't want to touch too much on the geopolitical right yet, but we've learned a lot about Russia's weakness conventionally, et cetera. And that's why Russia and China are in a league together to take on the West eventually, because China's got the manpower to do, and Putin has the nuclear throw weight to threaten and consolidate. But China in its Belt and Road initiative is trying to tie up infrastructure all around the world. It is a major threat, and you have to really watch that carefully. So don't get into any relocation situation where you're going to be near the Chinese.
Shifting the relocation question a bit, this is not an unusual question, I'm sure, to people asking you, but rather than pinning a particular fixed location where people should try to put their eggs in that basket, Christopher K. asks, and I'll expand a little bit, he says, do you have an opinion on a boat as a traveling home / fishing platform and a haven? And some people in the U.S. also would consider a recreational vehicle, RV, coach, that sort of thing, something that you can move from place to place. What are your thoughts about people using that as a major element of their strategy for strategic relocation, is either boat or RV?
It's a good question. I have covered this in some detail, both in my consultation and in my thinking over the years. Having done a lot of sailing myself, I love sailing. But let me say this, first of all, about the RV. First of all, you don't want to have a large vehicle, even if you do want to escape to a retreat with a huge, large vehicle. You want to have the smallest vehicle possible, and even a bicycle or an electric bike in the trunk in case you get locked into a traffic jam, which is inevitable if people are trying to get out of city like in Katrina. So RVs are going to be very problematic, not only in terms of fuel usage, but getting long distance. If an EMP grid down, you're going to have pillaging, you're going to have roadblocks, you're going to have people stealing gasoline. Getting through that in an RV is impossible. Possibly an off-road vehicle where you can bypass the roads might make it, or a motorcycle, but that's limited to a single person. You can't carry much with that. I think it's very important, rather than an RV strategy, is to have advance warning. If you're going to have to get out of a major city into a retreat site, you're going to have advance warning, or at least be living on the periphery so you're the first one out of the area, not the last, getting in traffic. Now, the boat situation is very interesting. It's very tempting to base it on existing conditions where you can get out in your sailboat and miles away from anything. My problem with the boat strategy is this. Piracy will increase, and you're not allowed to have weapons on boats and get into any port in the world. So you can't go and defend yourself, at least legally. And if you have weapons confiscated, they'll confiscate your boat. So it's become very problematic to have weapons on board. But piracy is the big problem in a slow boat. Now, if you've got a fast cigarette boat that you can outrun them, that's fine. But how far are you going to get, on a gas-guzzling cigarette boat? So I'm not optimistic in the long term either about islands as retreat sites, because once they get occupied or you get surrounded and they're going to come ashore, there's no place to go. But here's the way the boats can help. If you're stuck on Manhattan, for example, have a boat at the harbor, something that you can get out and away from that island, because you're not going to get out by the roads. If you're in Florida, for example, and if you have to get out of that. Now, Florida, one of the reasons it's a zero-rated state is it's only got two ways out of the state. And in a major meltdown or EMP situation, you're going to deal with no air conditioning in Florida, and people in Florida know you don't want to live there without air conditioning. There are places where you can grow things in Florida. It's got a lot of agriculture. But I worry about the fact it's a long peninsula, and once society gets into a refugee status in an EMP strike or war, and people start to move out of Florida, it's going to and empty out into the southern states. It's going to be very difficult to deal with. But if you have a boat, and people can't leave Florida, you can at least get out, go around the tip of Florida and get out into the southern or the Gulf Coast region of the United States and get into safer areas. So that's the only thing that I allow for in terms of boats as viable exit strategies.
We've touched on briefly a couple of times here geopolitics and how those things are shifting. You certainly talked a lot about the pandemic-related lockdowns and things that have exposed the vulnerability that people might not have realized they were subject to in the jurisdictions that they currently live. As we look into the broader theaters that are unfolding geopolitically, what are the main concerns you have that you think people need to be paying attention to, and your interpretation of the meaning of some of these events that may be different from what they're hearing about on mainstream media? Yes,
one of the things that I felt strongly that the exaggerated pandemic was a conspiracy at a high level. They took advantage of the fact that Americans have this inherent trust of the medical establishment, which I do not share. The medical establishment is ruthless in its enforcement of very dangerous drug-oriented protocols, and doctors go along with that because their livelihood is threatened by their license, etc. So I think one of the purposes of the exaggerated pandemic in terms of a strategic threat was to have an excuse to enact all of these emergency orders at a local level, which are unconstitutional. There's not a single state constitution that allows for emergency orders in the Constitution. There's not in the federal Constitution, doesn't allow.
Yeah. Dr. Edwin Vera, constitutional attorney on here, said the word emergency does not exist in the U.S. Constitution. Yeah,
that's right, or any state constitution. And so these are totally unconstitutional. The main purpose was to get people used to living permanently under emergency order. And we have, and they're still there. They have not been lifted. They can reenact lockdowns, they can reenact mass vaccine mandates at will because those emergency orders are still there. Now think what happens when war comes. When you have real emergency and you're going to have martial law, and people will think nothing of it. The diminution of their liberties because we've gotten used to it and we've accepted, or not all of us, but the majority of people have accepted that. So geopolitically, what's happening in the world today is that we have three dangerous predator centers in the world that we have to deal with. The first is our own globalist deep state, which has a globalist agenda of taking away national sovereignty and getting us into a militarized global government. They need another war to do that. And that's why the globalists have been building future enemies, by giving aid and trade in military technology to Russia and China over the years. They did that under detente and under a variety of advisors. It's amazing what happened during the Clinton, even the Reagan administration, up through the Bush administration, about allowing Chinese into our weapons factories in the United States to steal technology. And the Department of Commerce was one of the biggest about authorizing that technology to be transferred. And so we now, in this Russia-Ukraine situation, found, I might preface this by the fact that there have been three major worldwide deceptions in the past 20 years that have greased the skids, so to speak, for these various conspiracies to play out. The first one was the phony fall of the Soviet Union. That's a very important thing to understand, that the communists really went underground. They gave orders for the various dictators in the Soviet states around the world to step down, to tear down the wall, to let the protests go forward, unimpeded by the Stasi or the KGB. And Putin right now is in the process of trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union. First step, of course, to take back Ukraine. Ukraine is very important to the Soviet Union because it's where most of the ballistic missiles were manufactured. It has major steel industry there. It has the agricultural base that Russia depends upon. And so that was no surprise to me when Putin used the excuse of defending the rights of the Russian-speaking people in Donbass and created the false, claim of neo-Nazis being the threat. Neo-Nazis, whether it's in the United States or in Russia or anywhere, is the term that they use to denigrate your opposition. You call them neo-Nazis. And you pay people to become neo-Nazis so that you can justify those types of things. But the important thing to realize is that, unfortunately, a lot of conservatives in the United States have become deceived by the masters of deceit in Russia, Putin claiming to be a Christian, claiming to build Orthodox churches. Anybody who believes that a colonel in the KGB could be a Christian, is foolish, any more than they might. And most conservatives don't believe that Bill Clinton was a Christian just because he went to the Washington Cathedral once, or Barack Obama. But they believe it in Putin because they tend to want to believe that anybody or bad globalists are against must be good. And this is a real strategic error on the part of people like that. And the major evidence that they give for that is the widespread view that the Maidan Revolution of 2014 in Ukraine was a Western coup of a legitimately elected president, who was a communist, Viktor Yanukovych. But it wasn't true. It was as false a Western coup as the phony fall of the Soviet Union. And it happened very simply like this. The protesters were funded in large part by Victoria Nuland and some of your democracy funds that flow out of the United States. But the coup was only won, technically, in February 2014, on a Friday, when the Berkut, the riot police, who had previous months been surrounding the protesters in the Maidan Square and wouldn't let them out, were told to stand down and stayed in their barracks. And the next day, the communist majority in the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, ousted their own president, a communist. Now we have to ask ourselves, who could have given the order for the Berkut to stand down and stay in their barracks so that the protesters even had the run of the presidential palace? All those guards stayed home too. Could the Western globalists have told the Berkut to stay in their barracks? Not at all. Could the Western globalists have told the communist majority in the Rada to oust their own president? Not at all. They did it to pave the way for Petro Poroshenko to become president of Ukraine, who masquerades, he's friends with Russian oligarchs, he's a plant, but he had the reputation of being pro-Western, and he proceeded, as soon as he was president, to antagonize the Russian majority in the Donbass. And that gave Putin the excuse to take Crimea, which he did in 2014, and to start the stealth invasion of Donbass. So you see, this is a very complex situation. It's not as simple as good guys versus bad guys. There are no good guys in Ukraine because it's an old Soviet state. All the corrupt communists in the bureaucracy were still allowed there, were still there. They still took bribes even after the phony fall of the Soviet Union. Same thing in Poland, same thing in Romania and Bulgaria. They never purged the communists out of the bureaucracy like we did after World War II with the Nazis. And so Russia still has a great deal of their fingers in all of the former Soviet states. And in fact, many of them are members of NATO, and they're acting as spies for Russia, feeding information to Russia. So it's a very complex situation. It's not going to turn out well. I think there will be a nuclear war toward the latter part of this decade. And your listeners, if you are interested in liberty and finance, need to really understand that. Because even though the media is not going to warn about you, our government is building deep underground bunkers. They know it's coming, and they're preparing their retreats, etc. So don't be stupid by listening only to the mainstream media tell you that everything is fine. Oh, they'll tell you that China's a problem or that Russia's a problem, but they're not going to warn you about war. Nobody considers war a reality. Now, there is this issue of Putin's threat of using nuclear weapons, but it's a hollow threat. And I'll tell you why. Because if Putin threw a limited nuclear strike at any NATO target, what would it do? It would demand retaliation by NATO and the United States, who has nuclear weapons. It would demand retaliation. You don't just throw a nuke at a nuclear target or a missile without getting retaliated. Now, let's suppose that he throws all his nukes, and Putin's nuclear forces exceed ours by almost 3 times. Now, you won't get that from the CIA, but I'll tell you, it's about 3 times larger. Our nuclear missiles, our 400 ICBMs, used to have 3 warheads on them. They took the 3 off and replaced it with 1 small warhead. At the same time, Russia's building the Sarmat-2 missile with 15 maneuvering warheads that can evade any ABM system. And they have hundreds of Sarmat-1 missiles and other ICBMs that they've never dismantled. Now, if they threw all of those, they could decapitate the United States military and our missile forces. But what could they do with that? They couldn't consolidate the victory. They don't have the manpower to occupy Ukraine, let alone Europe, let alone the United States. And nobody wants to occupy the United States with 1 trillion arms in private hands. So eventually the U.S., even if the military was nuked, could rebuild and would come after him. So Putin's not going to strike using military weapons unless he joins with China so that China can provide not only the secret nukes that they're building, and nobody knows how many they have, but they have the manpower to occupy. They have the manpower to consolidate a victory, and they're building the Blue Water Navy. They won't be ready till the latter half in this decade, in my opinion, and in the government's opinion. But when they are ready, believe me, there's a 100% chance we're going to see war someday with Russia and China.
These are very grim scenarios that you've described for us in the past, and some people who are already feeling overwhelmed at even starting the basic steps of gardening or getting some spare food and water on hand, that sort of thing, just throw up their hands in dismay. And so how can any of us feel adequately prepared to come through as a family the potential nuclear war scenario? What do you say to those who consult with you when they're feeling completely overwhelmed at anticipating such a scenario?
Great question. Very great question. There are answers. First of all, I want to disparage them from believing that politically we're going to overcome the deep state and gain back our liberty in the nation. Even if I were president, couldn't dismantle the deep state because you'd have to have the NSA give you surveillance data on all these people in order to prove they're traitors. And they would never do it because they're part of the deep state, okay? But even though we're not going to win this, and even though I believe that a nuclear strike in America is 100% certain because of Russia and China preparing for that. And by the way, I think the trigger event will be North Korea attacking South Korea. If you see a war in South Korea, within 2 to 3 weeks, we'll probably see the U.S. into World War III with China and Russia. But here's where the safety comes from the fact that there will always be pockets of liberty. Because number one, our United States spies in Russia and China know that they do not intend to hit U.S. cities, only military targets. Now, if you're in San Diego with military targets right there in the city, out to 10 miles with those military targets, you don't want to be. You want to move out of blast zones. I cover that in strategic relocation. Then you only have to deal with fallout. And fallout is fairly easy and not that expensive to protect against. And my books cover how to do a basement fallout shelter. And even the one book that we haven't mentioned is the high security shelter book, which tells how to do a block shelter within an existing basement, which is your cheapest option. For less than $10,000, you can do a shelter in an existing basement, which if you save enough money over the next 4 or 5 years, you can afford that. So they're not going to hit cities. It's not going to be a nuclear winter. It's not going to destroy everyone or kill everyone. Now, the EMP strike, taking down the grid, will probably kill more people than the nuclear weapons, because without electricity, people will go to pillaging and and become refugees. But you know, the blessing of that, Dunnigan, the blessing is that conservatives are a minority in every major city because of the fact that they're overwhelmed by Democrats. But this war will push people out of those cities, and conservatives will go back to their roots in rural areas, and there'll be new conservatives, majorities form, where they can control, to a certain extent, their own destiny rurally. Even the globalists. And by the way, the purpose of this Third World War and the U.S. government absorbing a nuclear strike on our military is to talk Americans into joining a militarized global government to prosecute the war. Nothing else will get the U.S. into a global government with this anti-globalist spirit in the U.S. and the Brexit controversy. COVID doesn't get us into a militarized global, but a war does, where a military is decapitated. And the added blessing of the vaccine mandate on our military, it's gotten a lot of good people out of the military. They won't be in the military when this strike comes and kills a lot of our military people. So people will be relatively unscathed if they are prepared and in rural areas. And those two are secrets, because even in a social unrest situation, it will not extend to rural areas if you're outside of an hour's drive of the major cities, because they can't walk that far. Now, over time, you're going to have some problems and criminal problems even in rural areas, and that's why people need to have basement space where they don't want to confront them. They can get out of the way and hide in a safe room. You should be armed, because at some point you're going to have to defend at least something. You just don't want to be shooting at mobs of starving people. That's not a justifiable. You want to get out of the way so they move on and to the next place, but they can't find you. So in retreating to rural areas, you're going to find new conservative majorities, which will help preserve liberty. And number two, you're going to be free from the greatest refugee threats from the meltdown of the grid on that. And you can start to reconstitute if you grow your own food. I think that the EMP strike will take down the grid for as much of a year because of these transformer problems. So there will be starvation, and it's not, unless you've got a lot of storage space and money to store a year's supply of food, you're going to want to be able to grow things. And you can grow after a nuclear event. Fallout dissipates within about 2 weeks. And so, you know, if you filter any surface water that you might have to drink, the particles are filtered out, you can survive.
Joel, for people who want to make sure that they get the latest editions of your books, which are the flagship books that they should be looking for, and where should they find them, and which version should they be going after?
Well, except for used books on Amazon, all of the books that we sell at joelskousen.com are the latest edition. They're the 4th edition of the Secure Home, the 4th edition of the Strategic Relocation, and the 5th edition of the High Security Shelter book. And, you know, even though my books are on Amazon, they're threatening to kick me off because I refuse to accede to their demands to have $1 million liability policy for selling books. I mean, just crazy type of thing. So if they kick me off, my books will always be available at joelskousen.com. Now, my weekly newsletter, which is even more important now because I cover and update this COVID situation every week, as well as world events at the World Affairs Brief. And it's changing so rapidly in terms of the liberty aspect that I really can't keep a paper edition like Strategic Relocation up to date fast enough. But the World Affairs Brief does do that. It's only $1 a week, and it will give you advance warning if there ever is one for this war coming up. And that's available at worldaffairsbrief.com. You can get a free sample by clicking on Request a Sample on the left-hand side. Easy to find.
We've been speaking with Joel Skousen, author and consultant. Joel, thank you for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
Pleasure to be with you again.
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we will let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be double boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Elijah, my brother Kaiser, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.